Hello, and welcome back to CyberSplainers. Today, we have an interesting topic for you, an interesting question. I'll just set it up with the fact that we know the cybersecurity industry is a massive industry. We talked about in our first episode and kind of our premise that there's billions of dollars being spent on cybersecurity. It's massive, and yet it's not necessarily working as perfectly as you might think it would for the money we spend. I don't want to go down that topic too deeply, but I want to talk about the money aspect a little bit. There is so much money being invested and spent on cybersecurity. And I just simply want to get to, does spending more money mean you're going to be more secure? Something to that effect. We'll explore areas around that a little bit, but the bottom line is, does more money mean better security? So to explore the topic of money and spending and validation within cybersecurity, I have a guest today that I met maybe a couple of years ago. He was working for a low budget nonprofit that kind of inspired my attire today as well, with the jungle theme. He was working for Zoo Atlanta at the time, and he's since worked for federal government and now in healthcare. So he has an understanding of having to work with short budgets, and having a short budget, thin budget, doesn't mean you can't be secure. It just, I think, maybe requires a little more thought and effort. And I'll introduce Justin Echoberry, because he is more of an authority on this than I am, I guess, from that consumer side, from the customer side, from managing cybersecurity for different organizations that have, in many cases, very limited budgets, but still strong requirements, and have to take things seriously. So Justin, say hi if you want to give a little background as to why you care, or anything I missed, or why this is something that you know about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, so I mean, this stems from where I started my information and cybersecurity career in the nonprofit space, right? And we know we can get tools that cost anywhere from $7,000 a year all the way up to 100 plus, right? You get into those big SIEMs, those big data lakes, like you're talking a massive amount of money. And there are a lot of companies out there that might not be able to afford those big flashy tools, but they might not necessarily need them. And that was one of the things that kind of hit me when I first started, was coming into this industry thinking, oh, it's going to be so cool to have these flashy instruments, these flashy tools. Everyone's trying to sell you from every corner. They're taking you out to baseball games, football games, whatever it may be. And then you see that price tag at the end of the talk. It's like, we can't pull that. So does that mean that as a company, we have to just negate security? Is security just not a thing? Are we going to be completely vulnerable? So that took me down the road of, all right, where I'm currently working now at Zoo Atlanta, I'm extremely passionate about the mission and the company. I'm refusing to allow the fact that we can't afford this big flashy tool to compromise the industry as a whole or the company as a whole. That's just not flying with me. So I did my own research. I talked to a lot of people in the industry that kind of revolved around the same thing. And when you start looking at the core of your entire company, you realize there's a lot of things that you already have in place and that are not these gigantic expensive tools that can go ahead and fill a lot of that what you deem security emptiness, right? For example, like many companies out there who are, a Microsoft environment, they might have a standard Active Directory and domain controller. That's pretty standard when you're working with even a smaller company. If you have, again, that Microsoft environment, there's so many security policies, hardening things you can do just right there in group policy and AD, right? Like it's amazing what you can do as long as you go through and understand what you have. So one of the first points that I wanted to focus, particularly at Zoo Atlanta and as I got through my career, because it was just good to learn these things, was really learning about the tools that you already have. What is already built into your environment that your company's already budgeted for? It's budgeted for, in perpetuity, essentially. And what can you use in that space? So for me, in the beginning, again, it was that AD environment. We were fortunate enough to also have an Azure environment. And Microsoft brings a lot of security to the table just by default. So it's going through and really learning those tools and what those capabilities are to spread that horizon out there. And I mean, you really you get a pretty big distance on it. 80 alone, like when you think about password policy, that control can be controlled through group policy. You know, making sure no one has local admin on their machines can be controlled through group policy. Um, all that sort of stuff. You know, getting rid of all the services that you're not really using in your environment. All that can be done with group policy, and all that's included. Like it's not some extra budget item. And so when you think about that, you can really start getting down at those basic areas to try and then stretch whatever security budget you are given to make sure that those areas are effective and efficient. And that's kind of what started me down that path in the beginning.
Perfect. That's very cool and not uncommon, but and I don't want to skip too far ahead. I want to kind of get there in the conversation, but you covered a lot just in that, and there's so many areas I want to dive into. But maybe I want to take a step back first and just kind of say, early in the cybersecurity world, which I predate you a little bit, I'm pretty sure. But back 30 plus years ago, cybersecurity was still a relatively new thing, and we didn't really call it open source at the time. There was more the freeware shareware concept, and a lot of the tools were free or kind of function limited until you paid a little bit. And then the commercial tools came on when firewalls and antivirus became a bigger thing. They became more of a commercially viable entity. And I don't want to talk about, hopefully our listeners and I'm not trying to pump anybody up or please any vendors or manufacturers. I don't care. We try to talk frankly and honestly. I work with them. I know them well, and we do need products. There's a valid industry out there. So I don't mean this in too derogatory of a way, but there were always these free tools, and there still are. There are things that cost nothing that are functional or can be functional. And then there are products that cost an arm and a leg that maybe do certain things better, maybe don't. But where you started is kind of in the middle with products you might already own, and taking stock and taking inventory is a great first step for anyone who's kind of trying to figure out, should I spend? And why would they be asking that? It could be they saw a commercial, they saw an advertisement, they heard somebody talk about this great product. That sounds wonderful. I really want that. And I've seen too many times where they jump right to buying that, or at least starting to investigate it before realizing or thinking about they might already own something else that can do that thing. And I've seen a lot of money spent on things that just weren't necessary. Not that,
Exactly. You know, and I think so many of these tools, like you said, they almost feel like a redundant space, right? And so when you're really getting down to that core and you do have that set budget that you need to really stretch effectively, you need to figure out where the legitimate holes are. Not the gaps that maybe there's a little bit of an efficiency or maybe it's a little bit slower or something like that. You need to start where the holes are and know where those holes are by knowing what you already have. Just like you said, I mean that's a really good point. You want to make sure that you're filling gaps, not just covering stuff that's already there.
yeah, I actually want to take another step back, kind of a different direction back, because you mentioned budget, and that's, I think, a first foundational question is, what is or what should your budget be? And that's a whole different philosophical question. There's simple equations, and we've talked about this in other episodes, and it continues to be a thing. The equation that you kind of weigh vulnerability, threat, and risk in various ways. And it continues to evolve, and people make modifications to it. But those three terms are key to understand and figure out what your budget could and should be. Or, is there any? I'll start as an extreme example on the consumer level. How much should the average consumer family spend on cybersecurity for their family, for their home? Probably not, because there's not a lot to lose. And you kind of start with, what's the worst case scenario? It used to be somebody, some kid down the street gains access to your home network and deletes all your family photos. That's bad. It's hard to put a dollar value on. As long as you have them backed up, you're okay. It's just a nuisance. It's a pain. Or maybe they get into your checking account if you were running, software that did that back then before it was all online. Ransomware has changed that a little bit, and there's bigger risk at home because it can cause more of an issue and potentially be more damaging. But even then, you have to look at the worst case. What if they totally wipe me out? Worst case happens. What's the cost to me? And if you figure it's, a few grand, maybe, then you have to factor in, well, what would it cost to avoid it? And if it would cost $5,000 to potentially save you 2,000, it makes no sense. You don't buy it. It makes it very easy. If it costs $20 to buy something to help, maybe that makes sense. But in the corporate world, it's much harder, and that equation gets much more challenging to figure out what the variables are. But it's an important place to start. What is your actual risk? What do you stand to lose? And then that kind of dictates, okay, maybe it makes sense to spend up to this amount to avoid that. Have you seen that equation played out a lot, or?
I have. And this isn't even necessarily just companies that I've worked with. These are companies that I've seen across the board with friends that I've talked to, things of that nature. And it's one of those. I like you that you brought up. The idea of risk and the appetite for risk. That's a conversation a lot of companies haven't really had. Maybe on the technical side of things. Like you come into a company and you're being asked, what can you do? What can you protect? The first question I'm going to ask is like, well, what do you want to protect? As an organization, even as a family, you need to sit down with your decision makers and decide what data, what information is most important to you, and put a quantitative value on that. Like you said, you gotta measure that ROI between if this data is gone versus, okay, the cost to protect, is that going to match up? And if it doesn't make sense. But you're not going to know those numbers until you've looked at all the data that you have, all the information that your company's bringing in, and value that to some extent. A family might value those images that they can't get back extremely high. That's perfectly on them. It's up to them. It's a completely subjective stance, where another company might value, say, donor data versus employee data. Maybe that donor data is a lot higher than employee data because there's a lot more value there for whatever reason. I hope a company doesn't do that. I hope they're valuing their employees on an equal basis. But it's that kind of balance that you're looking at. So it's defining those scopes and defining those I don't want to call them silos, but those different sets of data sources, and protecting them in a manner that fits that bill. Right. So I agree with what you said completely, that it's a very much a balancing act of making sure that the cost is going to outweigh the reward, or the reward is going to outweigh the cost. Excuse me. That's the other way around.
And I think, and I don't like to make excuses, but I like to understand the reasoning behind things. And I think sometimes the reason that doesn't happen is that cybersecurity is the responsibility of some technical folks. And the technical folks know how to solve, or want to solve, the technical problems. This is not really a technical problem. This is a business problem. This is kind
Absolutely.
of it involves different people, different personas within an organization, especially a bigger organization that has more specialized jobs and responsibilities. Who in the organization determines what that budget should be? Who can set that value proposition and determine, yeah, we stand to lose this much in reputation or whatever the cost may be. And some of those are not hard costs; they're very soft and hard to calculate. So if they're not doing that calculation and saying, yeah, we can spend up to 10 million a year if it helps protect us, then, they're just tasking the technical side with, hey, give us a budget. Tell us what you need.
Exactly.
Well, what do I need for what? To what's our appetite for risk? And it's not an easy thing, but it's essential.
It's not. And
yeah.
I think a lot, and this is from my perspective, never being in that, like I've argued trying to get budget, but I've never been the one to decide to, like, okay, we're going to give you this. My perspective seems like it's almost that fear of not understanding, right? So when you think of cybersecurity, a lot of people initially go to this extremely technical range and technical side of the spectrum, and they get really bogged down in the details of, like, I just don't understand what I'm securing here. It's like, I don't need you to understand the technical stuff. I just need you to understand what you want to protect, and then we'll deal with the side of it. We can give you prices on what things are going to cost, but I need to know how much you're willing to spend. If you're willing to give me that number first, I can do a lot more for you. And again, I think it just stems from that misunderstanding that you don't need that technical knowledge to make that budgetary decision.
Right. Well, and it's also hard because it's not a definitive thing where for this much I can get 100% guaranteed security.
Exactly.
No.
Yeah.
It's for this much, I can get you 50%. For this much, I can get you 80%. And it's kind of, and even that's not going to be hard and fast. And, and that means I'm still 20% vulnerable. What does that really mean? What's the likely? I have seen some try to calculate it and I think this has been spawned, especially the last decade, by insurance, cyber insurance, and by compliance. Those have been factors that have forced a little bit more reckoning with the finance of cybersecurity. Because if an organization is now required to have cyber insurance, they're going to have to talk to those cyber insurers, and they've got people that their job is to calculate those numbers and those risks and say,
exactly, right,
we'll give you a policy that covers you well, but the premium is going to be this much a year. But they'll also put caveats now that if you do this, this, and this, the premium will drop by this much. And it starts incentivizing financially spending and doing the right things. I think we're finally seeing that start to be more meaningful and more correct, where early on they were kind of guessing and just kind of throwing numbers out there. And there were a lot of check boxes. And if you check the box, you reduce your premium, even if you weren't doing it well. Having this product and using this product and leveraging the product were different things. And they're starting to realize that. So I think that's coming through. And compliance is another one that forces it. You don't have a choice. You have to have this thing in place depending on your industry. You'll see that more now with your last couple of positions. I know have been more regulated between government and healthcare, whereas not-for-profits are much less so. But now it eliminates some of that lack of decision making. It forces it to you're going to have to do this, and then you have to have those conversations and do some of that math to figure out what you can justify. But I've seen in some cases where they say, okay, we can get this much of a premium for this much coverage. If we spend this much, we can drop the premium by this much. That's easy. But when you look at that, what's our exposure? And this isn't really something that's easy to do. But if you said, yes, our likelihood of a breach, again, this is not really good math, and you can't quantify it this way, but it's 20%, which maybe you could say likelihood is once every 5 years we're going to get breached if we have this much security. And if you can factor what the cost of that breach is and say it's going to cost us $10 million if we get breached. So once every 5 years, there's a $10 million likely cost. Now you have a number to work with. You can say, if I can reduce that likelihood to 5% for $5 million, does that math make sense? Now, if I got to spend $5 million a year, I'm spending $25 million a year to potentially protect me against $10 million a year if I don't do it. It doesn't make mathematical sense. And organizations will sometimes factor that in and say, I'm not going to do it because the cost doesn't outweigh the benefit, or the cost is higher than the potential benefit.
When you're looking at it like that, obviously that does create like a security gap, right? When your organization tells you that, okay, the cost of securing this isn't worth the cost of losing it, but you as a security engineer or the security team, you still have to try and fill that gap in some way. You can't just leave it open when you don't necessarily have to. So that's where you come in and you're like, all right, well, what are the other creative ways that we can really kind of get in there and keep this price down as much as possible? And that's a lot of what I came in, right? So, first in the industry, when it's the zoo world, the data isn't all that important, minus like customer and donor data. That's the big stuff that we're trying to secure. If Joe Schmo down the road wants a cute video of a rhino, it's not going to cost us that much if he gets it off of our server somehow. But how do we make sure that doesn't happen to the best of our ability and what we have? And as we already talked about, knowing what you have in your environment already, making sure you understand that. But I think a lot of it, and this goes, in my opinion, across all industries, this needs to really be a focus across all industries, is getting down to the basics, the bare basics of just good cyber hygiene across your entire employee scope, right? Everyone has seen companies that do the monthly email phishing campaigns where it's like you click it and then you got to take a class and all this, that, and the other. And there's nothing bad about that. I completely agree that needs to happen, but that can't be the only thing that you're doing, right? And usually the other stuff, there's no cost associated with it other than maybe time. There's no cost in, getting an all staff meeting and going through and showing them those little tricks of the trade with the email. Hover over the link, make sure you know where it's going, check your sender list. If you're looking at it on your phone, slow down, hold the link for a second, and it'll show you where it's going. Teach them to take that time. When it comes to passwords, don't use the easy passwords. Give them the resources they need, just at a bare minimum stance of like, okay, what's a password manager? Let me show you how to use it. Here's the free ones. Here's the ones maybe our company uses so we can manage everything. So you're not using password 123, or, your company might have a 90-day password change policy and you're just adding an extra number to each single one.
Increment it. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Like let's just show you how to do that. One of my favorite ones that I know is getting a lot of attention right now is, don't put passwords in plain text on your desktop or anywhere on your machine. Let me give you a tool that is free to show you how to do that, to manage all your passwords for it. And you only have to remember the one. And I'm going to give you tips on how to keep that one complex that works for your mind. I think so many people don't realize, like, with processors and the way they are, if you have a password that's, 8 to 10, maybe even 12 characters, it doesn't matter what it is. It takes maybe 24 hours or 48 hours to crack, no matter what it is. But if you just extend that out, yeah, exactly, 3 or 4 more characters, and then you're good, right? As long as it's something that's relatively complex or not just a weird pattern. But it's those simple, just teaching moments to really start enforcing with your staff that can be a huge, huge impact on your overall attack surface and your overall scope and vulnerability and risk, right?
It's a great point, and I'm glad you helped transition us away from the budget. Okay, calculate the budget, figure out what you have to work with. But now that we have some idea of how much we can spend, let's spend it wisely. One other extreme case we might touch on a little later is those who have basically unlimited budgets. Doesn't mean they're going to be more secure. Doesn't mean they're spending wisely. They're throwing money at the problem, and that's not always going to solve it. But back in this area where you're talking about, when you have a restricted budget, you don't have a lot to work with, you have to be smarter about it. And you can be successful and be relatively secure for relatively little money. It just requires a little more effort, a little more thought, little more deliberate action. And I love that you brought up authentication. That's another whole separate topic where we have an episode coming on that. Where multi-factor authentication is kind of our go-to simple answer. Multiple factors make it exponentially harder to crack and break and steal login information. But that's not free. There are cheaper alternatives, and there are other ways to do MFA nowadays. But the traditional pricey MFA, if not done properly or not done pervasively, 100% of the organization, every user's using it, every server has certificates or some other sort of server-based MFA employed. If you're not doing it everywhere, you've still got that static password weakness somewhere.
Exactly.
So if you don't do it 100%, almost don't bother, spend that money somewhere else. But I've also seen the argument that better password hygiene and policies can be more effective, or at least very close to as effective as MFA. And that's passwords of certain length. And this is a whole separate discussion I don't want to get bogged down in, but there are some very simple practices to make very long passwords that are still memorable and don't need to be written down and don't have to be super complicated, that I really do like. And it doesn't have to be super expensive to get fairly decent credentials.
Exactly, right. I mean, I couldn't tell you the exact statistic now, but I'm pretty sure the vast majority of initial compromise is still phishing, right? It's still that fake email where someone does just give up their password. Yeah. And it's like, when you can harden your staff across that and make sure that they understand that to the best of their ability, you're really widening that net of making sure that you're protected, right? And building that relationship.
Yeah, and I would add into that privilege and privilege escalation, or inappropriate privilege.
Absolutely.
When you compromise a low-level user's password or credentials and you log in as them, far too often you have too much capability to do things that you just don't need and shouldn't be able to do.
Exactly. And that's basic hygiene things, right? Yeah. That's just understanding who has access to what in your environment. And you learn this concept of scope creep. someone changes positions in a company and no one thinks to go back and change what they have access to. And it's just, you get this snowball effect. And that's just basic work. All that is free to do. You have to do it, right? You
But
have to
it's
take the time.
easier to just give everyone in the company access to everything. Then we don't have
Sure.
permission issues. We don't have
Yeah,
to.
if you want to go down that route
Okay,
and, yeah, and your standard user has global admin across your whole environment, you go for it. You'll be the honeypot for everybody.
everything will just work until it's compromised. And yeah,
Exactly.
well, it's actually a perfect example of there are solutions that you can purchase to help solve that, to help reel that in and wrangle it in and say, yes, let's limit permissions. Let's monitor the use of permissions. There's some very successful products that we work with, that I work with, and I love the vendors. They do a great job of this. And in larger organizations, it's kind of needed because it's so hard to
Yeah,
control
absolutely.
manually.
Absolutely.
But you can do it yourself. You can go in police accounts, police credentials in a smaller organization with less vast, user databases. It's a little bit easier to do, but it's always possible. And it just takes that a little additional effort and additional thought and work to make sure that you're not over privileging.
Exactly. And when you're talking about budget with your company, that helps you make those decisions as to whether or not you want to go down that expensive tool route or do it yourself. Maybe there's more value in hiring a security engineer that can come through and automate the processes using different types of scripts in Python and PowerShell versus having an out of the box product. Maybe that's where your balance is. And it's understanding that a lot of these tools have like an open source kind of base that you can work off of. And if you bring someone in that knows how to build off of it and can engineer those things, then that can also be, pretty helpful in the cost scheme. But maybe, again, maybe that balance is different. Maybe someone's got you a really good deal and this tool is only going to cost you $15,000-$16,000 a year. We're bringing in an engineer who's going to cost you 80 to 100. So, you have that balance.
Now you're cutting right to one of the major points I want to make sure we convey that's vital is there's a cost somewhere, whether it's time,
Absolutely.
or capital, or operational expenditure, or people. Time is people, and that is money. And there's options, versus buying that you could buy this expensive product that says it automates everything. It's hands off. You deploy this and you're good, and it's expensive. And it's probably not 100% hands off. There's still probably at least some minimal requirement that you put in some effort and work with it a little bit. And then there's maybe an open source option that's free or incredibly cheap, but requires a lot of effort. But what does that a lot of effort mean? Does that mean a full-time employee? And what is the cost of that full-time employee versus the cost of that product? And which is better? And I, over 25 years ago, this was in the late 90s, intrusion detection, quick story, intrusion detection was a growing concept. It was before intrusion prevention. And there were a couple of players in this. And there was one that we were selling, the company I was with, that was a big commercial, big name product. And they were based on Windows and easy to use, nice, pretty interface. And they weren't cheap. And we sold that product, and I implemented that product, that solution for a number of clients, did decent intrusion detection, and it was pretty cool. There was a competitor that was Linux based and not as pretty, very command line driven. You had to do a lot more work at the CLI, hands on, get your hands dirty, but you could almost make it do more if you did it well. You had more control over it, but it required that effort, and it was a fraction of the price. And we were doing the equation, and certain clients would say, oh yeah, I've got a couple of really good guys. They can figure this out and they can learn it, save, 80% in the product purchase, but then have to put in 15 hours a week to maintain the product versus 3 hours a week. And again, it becomes math, and you do the numbers and figure out, all right, which is saving me more, having people dedicated to this or buying one that requires much less care and feeding. And there are options, and it makes it almost harder, the fact that there are options. You have to figure out.
Sometimes, yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to, again, understanding what you want, understanding what you have, and where you want to go with it. And I am all for learning open source software and utilizing it, but I I don't want to come off saying like, hey, that's the route you want to go down if you don't have the money to buy certain things, because you do have to be careful with it, right? Like a colleague of mine said something a few months ago to me that has stuck with me, probably will stick with me the rest of my life, excuse me. And it's like, if the product is free, that means you're the product, right? They're getting something out of somewhere. So if you're going to use open source, if you're going to use freeware, you need to understand what they're getting. That's not to say that it's bad. That's not to say that it's all good, but you just need to make sure you understand what you're getting. And like you said, that comes from having those people come in that really know what they're doing in those certain cases, and balancing that out. Trust me, I've used plenty of freeware out there, and I know where the data is going, and we're careful with what data, especially in this AI space. You have to be really careful what's going on. Um, but yeah, I just want to make sure that that's out there. That I'm not saying, go out there, buy everything free that you can, or get everything free that you can. Make sure you're careful with it, but it is definitely a resource that it can be utilized.
Yeah, it's a huge point. It kind of comes back to nothing's free. Well, the adage that you get what you pay for. It's true to an extent. I think more so, it's used on the cheap end, and that's used as a derogatory term. If you got something free or really cheap, you can't expect that much from it. And that maybe holds true. I think it's less true on the high end with the expensive products. Just because it was expensive doesn't mean it's good, and doesn't
Exactly.
mean it's going to work and do a lot for you. And I think that there's a lot of products that look glitzy and fancy, and either they're not as easy as they would make you think they are. They're not as good as they would make you think they are, or they're not the right fit for you. Just because it's a big, flashy, awesome product doesn't mean it's right for you and your environment. And there might be a cheaper
Absolutely.
product that's a better fit for you too, or, as we said much earlier, that you already own.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep,
look at what.
absolutely. And I think that comes down to the point of when you do get to that point where you're all right, you've got everything on your base set, right? You know the products you already have, your company is doing well, your employees are on the right track, all that. Now you do have that budget that you need to figure out where it's going to go. We already mentioned, you need to fill the holes that you have, that you're not um, doubling over or anything like that. But I think that's where really you start getting into the importance of relationships outside of your company. So I'm not trying to like advertise for anything, but in my opinion, one of the biggest things that I came through and was kind of a shock to me when I moved to the cyber world is that none of these tools are actually selling directly to the consumer for the most part. They're always going through someone else. And for the longest time, I was like, why does there have to be this middle person sitting there like negotiating all this stuff? Like it doesn't make sense. And then you start getting into the weeds of like, all right, so they're called VARs, value added resources. I know you personally hate that term, but I've grown to love it because there definitely is a need for it. And there needs to be a relationship between you and whatever VAR you choose to make sure that it's going to be functional, because they're the ones that are going to be able to bring to the table what they think fits best with you, right? So they're the ones that are responsible for coming in, talking to you, understanding your environment, your wants, your needs, all this, that, and the other. If you take firewalls, for example, there's probably over 100 different brands of firewalls out there. You got the big players, but when you get down to it, there's tons of them out there. So where do you even begin to choose? And I have a feeling if you're already working with a small budget, you're probably already working with a staff that might be overstretched. They don't have time to research all these individuals. So you really need to have that relationship with a company that's willing to do that work for you and bring to the table these tools that actually match what you need, right? I mean, that's how you and I, our relationship started, is like you guys were able to bring to the table things that would fit our environment. We told you what our gaps were. We told you what our holes were. We told you the budget that we had to work with. And then you guys went and looked to see if there was matches out there that could fit it. Otherwise, we'd be sitting there researching all day long. And frankly, we just don't have the time for it. So having that, that value added reseller, VAR, again, I know you hate the word, but
I
like,
don't mind the acronym. I mind that it's abbreviated as reseller, when
okay,
the
that's
value
fair.
add is the interesting part.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
That's the part I actually like.
But I think there is extreme value in a company taking time to find a particular VAR that works best with them and has a passion for what they're doing. Like, I couldn't believe that, there was a public incident that went around on like Instagram, things like that. We didn't even talk to you guys about it, and our account guy called us like, "Hey, heard this happen. You want to talk about it? You want us to bring things to the table and just see what we have out there?" It's that common cause that exists that you can find. Not everyone's going to have it. Not every VAR out there is going to have it, but someone out there it is, and take the time to find it.
Yeah, I think there's a difference, and I've actually got an episode planned where this is something one of my guests wants to talk about, is specifically that relationship and how there are different types of relationships. There are pure resellers that are just resellers. That's basically that for those outside the industry. I explain it as that's retail. You want to buy some retail product typically, and it's changing a little bit with online shopping and the world is getting smaller, but you go to a Walmart and you buy a product. Walmart didn't make the product. They just sold you the product, and they were the reseller. That's the model. And in the industry, in the tech industry, we refer to it as the channel, and there's actually other levels. There's distribution, and then there's the reseller, and then there's the customer. So you get manufacturer, distributor, reseller, and sometimes you can go direct. There are cases where you can buy directly from the manufacturer, but those are often specific types of products and specific industries. The basic reason is that the manufacturers can't have the reach. They don't have enough people or the model to distribute as widely. So they just make it, and that's why there's this supply chain of, in all different industries, some more physical, this one often very digital. But there are resellers who just resell. And tell them what you want, tell them how many, they give you a price, and you buy it, and that's fine. And there are uses for that, and we do that as well at my day job. We do some just pure reselling, but the more interesting ones for engineers, for technical people, for problem solvers, is to come in earlier in the conversation and say, here's the problem we have, here's the solution, here's something we need to solve. What would you recommend, or what's the right way to do it? And that's where the value added relationship can start, with helping make sure that you're going to purchase the right product.
Exactly.
And for me, not just purchase the right product, like this is the right one for your environment, for your budget, for your needs, for the type of organization you are, but also for the staffing you have, for the tolerance you have for needing to do care and feeding, or let's talk about a service plan around it where either we can help you or find someone that can help you or add services to it to help make sure that there's a plan for success, not just buy it, drop it off at the door, and wish you good luck. We know it's the right product for you, but are you going to succeed with it? We want to make sure you're going to succeed. So we have more of a relationship where there's a partnership there. And that's really kind of the key word, is partnering to make it successful. And
exactly. And that's a huge point.
I don't want to get on that soapbox, because we're talking more about, what you can do with what money you have, but it comes to that spending wisely. Sometimes you can't afford it. You just need to buy the product, and you have enough people, you've got staff, fine. And that we can do that. We'll help you find the right solution, get you good pricing, and deliver it and back off if that's what's needed. But other times, to get the real value, you want to make sure that you have that plan in place, and we work together to drive success. Because spending money and failing, doesn't matter what it costs, how much you saved. If it failed, it was pointless.
Exactly. Right. And when you have that stretched budget, like you can't afford to have that flop. You can't afford to have that failure out there. So you got to make sure you get it right the first time to the best of your ability. And that comes from that partnership and having that relationship. And then also, once it gets down to deciding whether or not you're going with company A versus company B, or product A, product B, it's understanding what you want out of it, right? Because like you said, there's going to be cost versus time. There's going to be care involved in the product. What do you need? So if I bring in when you get down to the point where you're actually, as a company, involved in these interviews with these products, by and large, they're doing relatively the same thing. They probably have pretty close to the same capabilities. If you're putting one against the other, it might come down to configuration. So what are those nuances that you want to look at to ensure that you're getting the most value for it? And that's obviously going to be subjective. For me in my career, starting in cybersec when the AI thing blew up and a lot of things going out, for me now, it's that personal customer experience. If you can give me good customer service, that's what I care about. If my product breaks, if I'm paying for a product and it breaks, I want to make sure that I'm able to get you on the phone, get a person on the phone or an engineer on the phone pretty quickly to get that product up and running again. Because obviously, if I'm purchasing it, it's filling a limit hole, which means that hole doesn't need to be open long. So I want someone who's going to be there, and either that comes from the product owners company or from the partnership with the VAR. They a lot of times they can host services too. It doesn't matter where it comes from as long as you're getting it, and you want to make sure those little nuanced things that you need are covered and that they're going to be there and they're going to be sure on it. And that comes that you control that as much as possible. Statement of works, contracts. You want to go through all those fine details that yes takes some time, but you want to make it you're covered. Because again, like you said, when you've got that tight budget, there's no affording a failure at this point.
Or if there is, you ended up wasting that limited money. And if you have limited,
exactly,
you can't afford to waste it. Never mind, did you not get what you needed, but you threw money at it. So it makes it, again, almost harder that there are options. You can try and save a little money and do this thing that's going to get you 80% of the functionality for 50% of the price. Maybe that makes sense. I hate to keep making it a math thing and numbers and percentages, but sometimes you have to look at it that way, where if I can get 80% of the functionality for 50% of the price, that's a bargain. Versus I can spend 100% of the price and get 90%. But it's not even just as simple as the product purchase price. But do you have the staff, the plan, the assistance, the support to get that value? Because you could buy that product that costs more, that's going to do everything, but it needs more help and there's less support available. It's going to be harder to realize that full value versus something that maybe doesn't go as far, but there's better support. You'll be able to ultimately take it further for potentially less money. And again, it makes it hard. I hate to sound salesy and pitchy, but leveraging partners that do this for a living, that do this all the time, that's where hopefully good partners, good VARs, good vendors, or just trusted partners and advisors can help organizations make the right decisions versus, and I know there are some out there, there are plenty out there that do this, they're focused on their profit. I want to sell you the thing that makes me the most money. A lot of them are short-lived. They're not around very long, but for those of us that have been doing this for a very long time, I think you foster that by just being upfront and helping look out for your customers. And it doesn't always mean making the most money. It means helping them be successful. So whatever that means. Sometimes, it's done affordably. Sometimes there's not an affordable way and it's going to cost. But it's being upfront and open about that and doing what's right for your organization or for your client's organization.
Exactly. And one last note, I don't want to talk about like purchasing products all that much, but one last note I do want to put on that just because it's something that I had never done before coming into the cybersecurity space, and I've learned to absolutely love it because it's so much fun. When you're getting down to that nitty gritty and you're deciding on price and what your budget is, and you're bringing in these products that you want to look at and you potentially want to buy, always negotiate that price. Put someone on your staff or someone in that conversation that knows how to just drill. And I came in very novice to this, like I wasn't good at it, but watching some of my colleagues do this, it's literally like magic, in my opinion. Sometimes how they just start spinning circles and they'll drop prices, 30, 40, sometimes 50%. If you want to buy a product and you can wait till the end of the year when everyone's trying to cover that spread of theirs and they're trying to get those last accounts in, man, those products and prices start dropping like crazy. And don't be afraid to leverage that. Like that can be intimidating for a lot of people, a lot of smaller companies. Find someone who's good at it. I guarantee they don't even have to be, a cybersecurity expert. They just have to be good at negotiating. I guarantee there's someone in the company that likes doing that. Your VARs will do it a lot for you as well because they also want you to get down to an appropriate price. But if you do have the chance to be in those conversations, in my opinion, I've grown to love it. It's one of the funnest parts about talking to third-party resellers. Like it's a blast just watching them sweat.
It's a funny topic, and I don't want to be triggered by it or anything, or trigger anyone else who listen. But it's definitely an issue, and I don't want you to oversell the idea of beat people up and squeeze them for everything you can. Because I've always thought, and I believe this, that if you simplify, really boil down the three parties in a deal like this in cybersecurity and tech in general, you've got the buyer, the actual organization, you've got the manufacturer, and you've got that value added reseller. They all need to be successful.
Mhm.
The
Absolutely.
manufacturer needs to cover their R&D costs and be profitable. They've got shareholders that want them to have a good quarter, so they need to be making money. They can't give it away. You've got the customer needs to get value for the money they're spending. I'm spending X amount. I need this result for that. I need to get that value and get that added security. And the partner, if they're adding value, again, if they're not adding value, fine, squeeze them, let them make nothing, let them do all the paperwork and not make anything. But if they're adding value, they need to be rewarded for that value and for the work that they're putting in. And they need to be profitable as a company too. And when negotiating, if every one of those three, again, there's more players involved, but if those three can all come out knowing that, yes, we're making enough money to support our company, we're making enough to provide the value and do the work that we put in, and you're getting what you needed to for the money you spent, then that's a good deal. Everyone can walk away happy, shake hands, honestly feel like, okay, we can all survive. We're all getting what we need. If any one of those three parties isn't, then that's not good business. That's not a good deal. And I've seen in all three cases, I've seen individuals that don't care about the other two. They're just out for themselves. We want to gouge you and charge as much as we possibly can, squeeze you for every bit we can get so that you're losing money. Because then I won. It's not about winning that transaction. It's about being fair and reasonable and everybody kind of coming out doing well. And I think that is more sustainable long term for businesses too. To, to
I
know
would
that.
agree with that. And when I talk about negotiation, I'm not just meaning prices either, right? Like there's a lot of times when you're reading through contracts and you see these generic, broad statements of deliverables, right? Don't be afraid as the expert in the room and representing your company to go through and like in this contract, I need you to define what that broad deliverable is. Because I hate to say it, there are fantastic companies out there. I've worked with tons of them. But at the same time, there's also companies that aren't that great, and I've worked with those too. And if you don't have those clear definitions in paper, like on writing, sometimes it can be a problem. So make sure you're willing to negotiate not just price, but like every aspect of the deal itself. Make sure you're getting what you think you're paying for, and there's no wiggle room into what you expect. Because
Yeah.
again, when it comes down to that low budget scenario, you're filling that legitimate gap, and you have to make sure it's filled to your expectation and what you need. Or even if it does work by the way they stated it, it still might be wasting money because there was a misunderstanding in the agreement or whatever it may be.
It's definitely one of the more stressful parts of that value added reseller job when there are services and our company is very services heavy. We do a lot of service delivery and both on the project based kind of and the ongoing and maintenance and management. Defining a scope, defining deliverables prior to a project is one of the trickier parts of that job for both the customer and for the service provider. Because again, you want everyone to come out okay and everyone to be happy at the end of it, that we spent a reasonable amount of money and we got what we needed for it. We got the value and we delivered the service and we were well compensated and we're able to keep our employees. We're not going to go out of business because we gave you too good of a deal. It's that balance and striking that balance. It's not always easy, but if you can, then you can all be successful and we can be better. But there's so much more that goes into it too, and we've barely scratched the surface. And I don't want to keep you too much longer. But we've covered a lot, and a lot of it that I didn't necessarily expect to cover, but that's the nature of cybersplainers. Kind of go off on tangents and talk about so many different things. Are there any other thoughts you wanted to get across, or things you wanted to share, or points you wanted to make?
Um, I think one of the biggest things, and this kind of stems back to the security awareness and talking to your employees. At the end of the day, if you can establish within your company a culture of security and understanding and get people caring about the data that you're protecting, it's going to make your life so much easier. You can have every product in the world, you can have every budget in the world, but at the end of the day, if your end users just don't care, that's going to be a problem. And it's building that relationship, building that culture that just makes life and day-to-day work the essence, right? I mean, one of the biggest things, and I've been fortunate, every company that I've worked for in the cybersecurity space, actually massive focus was relationship with the employees, right? There should be no reason that if an employee accidentally, clicks a scareware link on a Google sponsored ad or something like that, that they're petrified to tell anybody. It's not my job to punish you or get you in trouble. I'm not there for that. There might be some sort of report that I have to do at the end of the day, but I want you to just be able to call me immediately when it happens so we can fix it quickly. And, I'll have a fun conversation with you for the 10 minutes that I need to be on or whatever it may be, and we're going to keep this cool and relaxed. Because at the end of the day, if you just take that quick second, the first second it happens, just give somebody on your team a call, 90% of the time, it's all good. We can fix it. If I know there's an issue within 5 minutes of the issue happening, there's very few things that my teams can't fix.
Yeah, it goes to that philosophical question: is it better to be loved or feared? Is that,
Exactly.
and there's a balance there somewhere. But I like to think that people are more tech aware than they used to be. 10, 20, 30 years ago. They're more capable and a little more open to absorbing some information, some knowledge, and being taught versus being slapped on the wrist. Being taught by force and pain. No, here's a teachable moment. This is why that was a bad link. If you hover over this, educate them a little bit, give them a little credit that they can understand why, not just because I said so, and make them. I've used the phrase many times: make your employees assets instead of liabilities. It's a huge value, and it kind of doesn't cost you anything to increase your cybersecurity team to the entire organization. So they're all on the lookout for things. They're all aware. They know why they're being asked to use this painful password algorithm versus just do it because I said so. Once they understand a little bit more and they get it and say, okay, maybe that's a better culture. And you mentioned it, the culture is kind of the thing, is if you can make that security part of your culture and be accepting and be open. We've talked about this very recently. Okay, little hiccup, but we're back. So we were talking about assets versus liabilities. And I think if you can make it so that your employees, your user population, not just employees, could be students, whatever, or whatever your user base is, that are typically security liabilities and challenges and problems, if you can help them be at least a little bit of an asset instead, there's huge value in that for little cost.
Absolutely. I before my security career, I came from an animal training background, and one of the things I brought to the table that I pound as much as possible is the idea of reinforcement over punishment, right? It's always better to reinforce your staff than punish. I get you send out a phishing campaign, they click the link, they have a training that they have to go through. That's the punishment side of it. I understand that needs to happen. But what about all those people that reported the link? How are you reinforcing that behavior? How are you reinforcing the behavior of the people who might identify a security vulnerability and may come talk to you, right? You will always, in my opinion, get more and better long-term results from reinforcement over punishment. If your company can find creative ways to do that, doesn't necessarily have to be cash value. It could be something else, but some way to give that recognition that can be huge in the development and maintaining that cybersecurity culture that you want.
Bragging rights, instead of publicly shaming the loser,
Absolutely.
publicly pat the winner on the back and say, hey, so-and-so found the most malware this week or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, again, something that's relatively cheap to do. You don't have to spend big money on it, but now you've created that culture that just fosters better cybersecurity and better hygiene. So I'm a big fan. I love it. Again, so many different areas we could go with this. Thank you for dealing with the conversation as long as you did and so many different angles and perspectives on it. To come back to the question, just to see if we can arrive at an answer, we try to get close to an answer. Very few of our questions have a definitive binary answer. But does more money mean better security? One way of phrasing it.
Necessarily.
I would say no. I would say definitely it doesn't mean better security. I think the harder or the easier question is, does low budget or spending nothing mean less security? It's such a gray difficult thing to answer. I think it can go either way. You can spend a lot of money and get great security. You can spend less money and get good security.
Yeah.
It's more the in between. It's not about the products, the solutions, and the money. It's about the people. It really kind of comes back to our foundation and our early concepts of it's what you do with it.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. It's
Yeah.
what you do with it and how you use it.
So don't not spend. I'll be out of job, but but spend wisely and have a plan for success and getting value out of it, not just throw money at the problem because that rarely ends in good success. Cool. Well, thanks again so much, Justin. It was great to talk to you. Great to see you. Hopefully, I'll get to see you again one of these days before too long. Good luck in the newer gig, and thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. It was a blast.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe.